Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another Black Men Read Author Chat. My name is Raymond Williams. I am one of the book club administrators for Black Men Reads Book Club, and we have the honor and privilege to be speaking to the author, Remica Bingham-Risher, who is the author of Soul Culture, Black Poets, Books, and Questions That Grew Me Up. And we're glad you all are joining us today. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. If you have any questions for the author, please put them in the comment section. We will try to show them during the interview, or we will also try to answer them. If we don't get them earlier, we will talk about them later at the end of our session. So I will begin by reading a brief bio of our guest. Remica Bingham-Risher is a native of Phoenix, Arizona, and alumna of Old Dominion University and Bennington College. She is a Cave Canem Fellow and Appalachian poet, among other journals. Her work has been published in the New York Times, the Writers Chronicle, New Letters, Callaloo, and Essence. She is the author of Conversion, winner of the Naomi Long Magic Poetry Award, What We Ask of Flesh, shortlisted for the Hurston Wright Award, and Starlight and Era, published by Diodi Editions, winner of the Diodi Editions Book Award. And her newest work, that I just showed, first book of prose, Soul Culture, Black Poets, Books, and Questions That Grew Me Up, published by Beacon Press, September 6, 2022. She is currently the Director of Quality Enhancement Plan Initiatives at Old Dominion University and resides in Norfolk, Virginia with her husband and children. Please give a warm welcome and virtual round of applause to our guest, Remica Bingham-Risher.
Raymond, you are the best publicist ever. Did you just hold up all my books in the
I
intro?
did.
Sir, you are hired. I'm telling you. Thank you.
I did.
Wow.
So thank you for joining us. Before we begin the questions, I just want to give a little my observations of soul culture. So in soul culture, Remica Bingham-Risher has written a beautiful book about Black community, mentorship, personal growth, and revision. The book is a collection of essays that are all touching, inspiring, and heartfelt. In each essay, Bingham-Risher writes about a theme and centers one Black poet that mentored her at different times in her life. She interviewed 10 poets in total: Lucille Clifton, Sonia Sanchez, Patricia Smith, Natasha Trethewey, E. Ethelbert Miller, Honoré Fanon Jeffers, A. Van Jordan, Forrest Hamer, Erica Hunt, and Tim Sables, all who came from the era that bridges between the Black Arts Movement and the Cave Canem era that Bingham-Risher came of age in. Each poet that she spotlights serves as the connective, in my mind, as the connective tissue of each theme of each essay. One feeling I experienced after finishing Soul Culture was inspiration. Remica will inspire you to read more Black poets, to honor those that came before you, and to mentor those who are coming behind you. So let's start with the first question.
Okay. I mean, you set me up pretty good, Raymond. But that was gorgeous. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah.
So how did this cover come about?
I'm so glad you asked me
pick
that.
it and all of that. Yeah.
I'm so glad you asked me that. There are two brilliant designers, and every time I get to say their names, I like to say their names. So Carol Chu and Alex Camlin are the folks that worked on the cover. But I will say Beacon Press was fantastic throughout this process. They started asking me very early on if I had any ideas for the cover. And one of the things that I was set on was that there just had to be a Black woman there. And that was, pretty wide swath for us to work with. So they sent me some early covers a few months into the end of the process. And there was one that had an abstract Black woman that was much like what you see, but we had to kind of go back and forth and finesse some things about the shape. The hair was really important. She had to have a big fro, right? And it was important to me to make sure that that was kind of centered on the page. And the same thing. I mean, they were so careful about the lettering, the font, kind of being a throwback to another era, because
Yeah.
that was a lot of the things that I was trying to do, with this kind of bridging, as you already spoke about, with these, mentors that were kind of ushering me in. So, soul is kind of reminiscent of, like, maybe some of the Soul Train or the old album covers that you would see, right? And so they really did design this. They just designed the heck out of the thing. That was kind of my only input. And they listened to everything that I asked after we started finessing it. So I'm just so happy. I think they did a beautiful job. I'm grateful to them.
They did. I'm gonna hold it back up for everybody who has seen it before.
Thank you. Oh, look, we'll double time it. We'll just
Double time, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We got author D.L. White just said, I love that she got input and creative direction on the cover to get what was
Yeah.
to her.
Yeah, it's not something that happens all the time. And I am used to coming from, you saw my books of poems, they were with very small presses, as many poets are publishing with like really small independent presses. And fortunately, because of that, I had input on those covers as well. So I came into this very nervous because I thought, oh, Beacon is a bigger press. They might just decide we're running with this. That was something that early on we talked about, even as part of the contract, because I thought it was very, very important to have an image that drew folks in, particularly Black women. I mean, that's really my audience in many ways. And it's also just something that is important to me, for my own journey. So it was a great gift that very early on, that was part of the discussion, in the same way that editing the essays we were doing, kind of at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the title. What is soul culture? And what was the reason that you wrote this book?
Soul culture, interestingly enough, I have to give credit where credit is due here. Soul culture was a phrase that I had put into a query letter early on when I was reaching out to agents. And I thought of it as kind of this all encompassing phrase for thinking about Black life, signifying the way that we build community. And there's a kind of a longer definition of soul culture in the introduction. But it was a phrase that I hadn't really thought about at all for the title. But a dear friend and one of the folks that I interview, Honoree Fanon Jeffers, read over the query letter, as she is wont to do. She ushers me into so many professional spaces. And she said, your title is right here buried in your query letter. This should really be called soul culture. It had several different iterations of titles. I think at that point it was probably On Asking or something like that. I love a title with an on at the beginning. She was like, that's not it. And so once I had soul culture as an anchor, then that back half that got even more specific, Black poets, books, and questions that grew me up, came a little bit later in the process. Again, that was a little bit different too. But once we started talking specifically with editors, and something that kept coming back up was something that really shocked me. But my editor, Haley Lynch over at Beacon, talked very specifically about the fact that we don't get to hear the Black woman's interior voice enough. And I thought, oh, child, that's really important. And if I were going to do that, to lean into my interior voice as much as possible, because I wasn't used to writing essays. I was used to writing poems, and that being a very specific genre to like filter my experience through. When I decided, oh, if we're gonna lean into that, well, then I'm gonna come up with what I think is a title that really signifies on so much of who I am. And that questions that grew me up, that's a very Black Southern phrase, right?
Yeah.
So it really postures in a certain way to folks. And I sent them a few title suggestions. We were still trying to figure out what was going to stick. And I said, oh, if they let me name this book, Soul Culture, Black Poets Books, and Questions That Grew Me Up, I'm just going to do whatever I want. I'm going to write whatever I want because they're really interested in my most authentic self. And that's the one that stuck. So
Wow.
that was, a part of ushering me into the writing process as well.
Okay. Okay. And how did the book come about?
Ooh, well, that's a much a longer story too. You and I were talking before we started recording a little bit about the pandemic and how it kind of shook me to my core as a writer. I was feeling really siloed and alone. But I was talking to my husband early on about what project should be next. I had finished a book of love poems, Starlight and Air. I knew that I had these interviews that I wanted to eventually become their own collection. So I thought, well, the pandemic has set me down. This is really the time for me to develop a book proposal, for me to do real research on agents and people that I would trust with this book in their hands. And that's what I did for the first few months. I kind of crafted that proposal and then whittled down those agents. And when I sent out the proposal for Soul Culture, it looked very different. It really was those 10 essays in full. And the essays have been published in other places, most of them. And there were essays about craft kind of in between. I thought something that might set it apart from other books that were just essays, Q&As with authors was that if I focused on one aspect of craft that each poet was really good at. So maybe Patricia Smith was on persona poems, or Natasha Trethewey. I was thinking about the punctum and what she does with photography, right? So all of these things that, I presented at different conferences, etc. But with that were hardcore kind of like craft writing essays. And when I found an agent, Larissa Mello Piankowski, she said, this is beautiful, but the thing that I'm most drawn to here is your voice. And I said, well, that's wrong because this book is not about me. It's about these 10 other poets that, I'm paying homage to. Like for me, this was really like my gift to the elders. If I could do anything, even a fraction of the things that they had given me, this is what I wanted to do, to kind of collect these voices in this way. But the more we talked about it, the more we discussed what was important in the industry. Are interviews going to actually make their way? Is this going to be something that's, of course, your agent and publishers are thinking about what's going to move. Well, I'm a poet, so, we don't move much anyway. So we were never worrying about what was going to sell. We were worried about what was authentic, right? And so when we had those discussions and started looking for editors, we were looking for folks that could help us turn these essays into more personal essays that would really build on the life lessons that I learned from these poets. So that's really how Soul Culture came about, through the process of submitting this work to other folks and trying to move it out into the world. The whole thing shifted on its axis. And that's when it became really and truly when the Publishers Weekly, the little book announcement comes out about your book, and they write this really beautiful summary, something akin to what you did a few minutes ago when you were summing up the book, right? But folks write it beyond you. So it came out that morning. I said, oh, Lord, you guys called this a memoir. Now I got to write it. And that's what I did.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So you did primarily interviews. Were there any other, what was your other research process like? Did you have to go into any, and obviously for those who haven't read it, there's elements of memoir here. Talk about all of that, when you had to keep the personal in it as well as the interviews.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first and foremost, backtrack a little bit. These interviews weren't just a quick one-off with the writer. When I was reaching out to these writers, I was asking them if I could do a comprehensive interview that was like a study of their life. So I would start with, do you remember your first encounter with poetry from childhood, and move up through their books? Now, some of these folks, we're still burgeoning in the game. A. Van Jordan, I think, had 3 books out maybe when I interviewed him. But some of these folks like Sonia Sanchez and, Lucy Clifton, they're 30 books deep. So I would read every single thing they'd written in every genre. I would
Mm-hmm.
craft questions that were very specifically about the work, but also about these touch points in their lives. So the interviews, that's why the interviews themselves took a decade. Like, I would do maybe an interview a year because I'd be trying to work and teach, and I got married, and I, inherited great kids. And so all of those things were happening at the same time that I was putting together the interviews. And then when I decided that Soul Culture was going to be a memoir and essays, there was a whole lot of mining of my own life and my own history that I had to do.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that was going back to aunties and getting them to relate stories about Scotland Neck, North Carolina, about places that we know pretty well. Some of that was impressing my mother into service and making her a reader so she could check my memory in places where it wasn't exactly where they didn't jibe, because I think we all have separate ways of reclaiming our memory or reclaiming what we know about our lives, right? And much of it was reading constantly. So that's why the books ended up being part of it wasn't just these poets, but really and truly my reading life informed so much of who I was. So you'll see so many different references to authors that I don't interview and books that, came up as really pivotal in my life. All of that reading I went back to as well. So there was just a wide swath of research that happened over time, but it was really fun because I got to kind of ask myself, like, oh, this is what you really love in poems. Why do you love it? Like, let's reverse engineer this thing. And so that was a fun part of it.
Hmm. Were there any, when you were doing these interviews, were there any poets that didn't make the book?
Oh, there are no poets that I interviewed that didn't make. Every interview that I conducted made the book. There were plenty of poets that I didn't get to interview
Gotcha.
that I wanted on my list.
Mhm.
Elizabeth Alexander is always top of mind. She, we talked about the cover, but there's
Yeah.
a blurb from Elizabeth Alexander at the top that is probably my favorite part of the book next to the index, right? And so Kwame Dawes is another like longtime mentor, dear teacher, um, and so prolific. I always wanted him. Nikki Giovanni, I
Mhm.
desperately wanted Nikki in the book, but these are people that are really hard to tie down. It's funny, I'm sitting in my office, I'm looking at a card that Nikki Giovanni sent me when I was an undergraduate student. She came
Mhm.
to Old Dominion when I was an undergrad, and
Mhm.
I don't know what possessed me, but I printed out some little poems and handed them to her as I was asking her to sign my books. And she mailed me a card from the hotel where she was staying on stationery, signed,
Mhm.
just encouraging me as a young poet. And then put some of my work in an anthology years later. So there's so many people that have been just inspirational in their own right and that have chosen to kind of make sure that they're encouraging these little young poets along that I wanted to have in the book that I just didn't have time for. But there was no one that I asked who said no. Black poets are so generous. If
Mhm.
I asked them, they made time for me. So
Mhm.
it's a gift.
Yeah, that's nice. That's
Yeah.
um so when you were so in the process of when you were conducting the interviews,
Hmm.
and you may have said this a little while earlier, but were you did you know they were going to become a book, or was this just something you were doing at the time?
Oh, absolutely not. I did not know they were going to become a book. I
Okay.
started doing the interviews because I was forced into it by my teacher, E. Ethelbert Miller. The book is pretty much dedicated to Ethelbert now, so I guess I forgive him for that. But I was a graduate student working with Ethelbert at Bennington, and I was just so in awe of all these writers. We would talk at the residency, and I'd just say, "Oh my gosh, there's just no way anybody can do what Lucille Clifton does." She's just like magic. He pulled my coattail once. This is long before Black Girl Magic, but he said, how does a poet chart a path to magical? Like, how do you get there? What are you doing this for? If it's
Mhm.
magic, if you
Mhm.
can't do it too. So he told me, you got to get over this awe syndrome. And what you need to do is start interviewing writers. here are their emails or here are their phone numbers. Ethelbert is this major connector in DC. You're in College Park, Maryland, so you might run across Ethelbert every once in a while, Ethelbert Miller. And he knows everyone, knows everything, and started putting me in touch with the writers that I love the most. And he let me use him as a guinea pig. He's the first interview, ends up being the opening interview in Soul Culture as well. And so because he wanted me to kind of ask folks about craft and figure out, how do you make a life out of this thing? It's not magic. It's hard work, but people do it.
Right.
And that was my entryway into the interview. So I started doing kind of like one interview at a time. And then I did another. And then someone would come to me and say, "Oh, I saw this interview that you did with Tim Siebels. Do you think you could do something with Patricia Smith?" And Patricia Smith, by then I had worked with at Cave Canem and was a dear friend. And so I reached out to P. Smith and said, "What can I do?" So it happened very organically. And after I had 3 or 4, someone said, "These could probably be a book." There's a wonderful interviewer named Sarah Johnson who came and visited Bennington and had this book of 20 or so essays that were interviews that were out at the time, and said, "You could easily do this over time if you can collect enough of these." So then it was kind of in the back of my mind after I'd done 3 or 4 interviews. I had no idea the path that I was on or the time that it would take, but this is where we ended up. Yeah.
Nice. I noticed that, since it's based on these interviews, and I was thinking that some of the transcripts was going to be at the very end of the book, right? Like in the appendix or something,
I
right?
know, right?
And so I was thinking to myself, it would be nice if, and I don't know if this is something in the works or whatever, but
Yeah.
if you had a second book, a follow-up to this, that would just be those
Ooh,
transcripts.
that is not in the works, but we are trying to figure out what to do with these interviews. As I said, quite a few of them are published, and some of them are published in really prominent places. Like the Lucille Clifton interview was the cover of the Writer's Chronicle one year, and you can still find it online if you just Google it, Remica Bingham, Lucille Clifton. It comes up pretty quickly. Some of the other ones too, Sonia Sanchez was, and the Tim Siebels. So there are some of them that are still out and on the internet, but there are 4 of them that have never been published at all in their entirety. So I'm pulling from them and using quotes, but people haven't seen them yet. So we're wondering if those should be little standalones that we kind of publish at some point. If those should go to journals, should we compile them? So it's still something I'm thinking about. If Raymond has a good idea, if anybody else has a good idea, or a press that's willing to make it happen, call me. We'll talk about it, because when I tell you these interviews are just a treasure trove, like there's so much. That was the biggest difficulty, I think, in putting this book together, narrowing down what I would pull out of, Lucille Clifton. You get to sit down with Lucille Clifton for 3 hours. How are you going to truncate, what she says to you, the wisdom that she brings to that conversation? Or Natasha Trethewey, right after she wins the Pulitzer. Like there's so many folks that really were so gracious, so kind, and generous. And that was the difficulty, how I narrowed down to the things that really stuck out the most to me and really worked with my own trajectory. That's how I ended up having to narrow, as you talked about earlier, based on those themes that I came up with. But there's so much that's missing that I want to make sure it's in the world.
I know that, and I don't know if this is the best, if this would be the best place, but I thought about, I think Penguin Random House they have this series called The Last Interview.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
You seen those?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they have they have a whole plethora of people, but I know I read the one for Martin Luther King. I think they have one for like James Baldwin.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a whole lot of folks. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like 5 or 6 interviews that they did throughout their lives.
Yeah.
And then the last one is the last one.
The last interview. Yeah.
But yeah, it's hard to think of if there is any press like that kind of does that type of, or is known for that work. So
Exactly. And it could be, it could be something small, independent that we do. I love independent presses. I'm fine with that. I'm a poet, so we can go back to a little tiny indie house. And even if it's just a matter of doing those little four that you can't find anywhere in the world as little chapbooks, maybe
mm,
that's something to think about.
yeah,
I won't let it go. It'll happen. They'll be in the world somewhere. I'll make sure that you can see them. But all the ones that are mentioned in soul culture that are published, almost every single one is on the internet. So if you just Google
mm,
my name and the author's name, the full interview will come up if you're like deeply interested, like Raymond is.
yes. Thank you for reminding me that because I'm definitely looking those up.
Okay.
um,
I love
so
it.
we have a question in the audience, and it mirrors a question that I have. So, author DLY asks, "What was the most difficult / challenging part of writing this or other books?"
Oh.
And I'd like to add too with that, specifically since this was your first prose book. Uh,
Hmm.
how what's the difference between when you were writing this versus when you're writing your poetry books in terms of challenging or the easy, whether something one is easier or challenging than the other.
Oh, that's a good. So there are challenges to every book. Let me just be clear. For me, the challenge with poems is that I'm a slow writer and I'm a strident revisionist. So every poem you see goes through at least 30 revisions, right? So much of that I'm working through over time. Usually takes me 6 or 7 years between books of poems. I'm always thinking deeply about what's happening sonically, poetry is an oral and oral art, so I'm thinking about what's happening sonically in the poem, but I'm also just thinking about clarity, because poems for me are the way that I just question what I see in the world. I don't get a whole lot of answers from poems, but it helps me work out those questions.
Mhm,
And I know that that's a very personal act, so I need to make sure that it translates beyond me on the page. So that's why it takes a long time to write poems, and that's probably the most difficult part, DL, just those translating, to make sure that those poems are coming across clearly, and that they still have heart.
mm,
Those two things, that's the balance, right? I'm looking for beauty, but I'm also making sure that they move me in some way and hopefully will move someone else. With prose, the probably the biggest challenge, I've already mentioned some of the challenge, but the biggest challenge for me honestly was doubt. It's just self-doubt. I had no idea that I was going to be moving into prose in this way. I had been writing essays. I had published a few essays even, but I certainly did not imagine a memoir for myself at this
mhm,
juncture in my life. Also, I was thinking about, I had a very narrow view of memoirs, even though I had been reading. I really do read a lot of prose.
mhm,
So I'm reading lots of fiction. I'm reading lots of memoir. I love personal memoir. And I know that they come in every shape and form, that sometimes it's a week in someone's life, not that they've had some huge life event that has to equate to, a story that they're telling, a narrative that, is only about that one thing. So I knew this could exist in theory, but I
mhm,
just doubted my capability to put it together. And
mm,
so I was very grateful that so many brilliant poets are writing in prose. So I went back to so many of those books over time, especially during the pandemic when reading was the way we communicated with each other and talked through. I already mentioned podcasts, craft.
mm,
Thinking about craft a lot was very helpful to me. There was nary a morning while I was writing and revising this thing, that I wasn't like pulling over in my car to scribble down what someone just said so I could go back and address that in my own work, or go back and read that thing that they just mentioned. But getting over that doubt with the help of like my editors and folks that I really trusted who read the manuscript from top to bottom for me, that was the biggest issue I had while writing Soul Culture. And eventually I fell into a kind of groove. And there were other pinpoints that helped me feel like, oh, okay, yeah, this is absolutely your story. And no one else experienced this, so no one else can tell it. It has to be yours. And it's worthy of being in the world. So you got to do it. So there was no way I could move past the work. I had to move through it. And I'm grateful that I did.
Okay. So, excuse me, among other things, your book, Soul Culture, helps the reader to develop a reading list of poetry collections. So when I was reading the book, I have a notebook and I'm writing down, this title sounds interesting, and I'm coming up with this long list. And I was thinking about it where I was like, this could become overwhelming for somebody,
You're writing down everything. Yeah.
if you write down everything, right? So my question is for that, if you're a reader that's new to poetry, who would you recommend they start with,
Oh,
or
yeah.
more as a maybe as a starter package type thing, and who would they evolve or gradually evolve to next?
I love that. The answer is always the same. When a student comes to me and says, I'm not really sure about poems, but where could I begin? My answer is always start with Lucille Clifton. Lucille Clifton didn't become, the goddess of Black poetry for no reason, but also I talk about in the book that she's just the economy of language that she uses, the clarity. Talk about trying to get poems to be clear, the clarity and sleight of hand that she has with these poems. Honore and I joke all the time that it takes us 4 pages to do what she can do with 4 lines and no punctuation. Right. And so if you start with Lucille Clifton, the books, especially very early on, the books, I always say quilting is my favorite. So I would say maybe start at quilting. So the books are small enough that you can really read a full collection of Lucille Clifton in an hour or two. The poems are small. Often they're connected to things like myth or things that you might have some kind of familiarity with. So that gives you another tie in to things. But I think there's no one who does clarity better than Lucille Clifton. And she'll hook you and she'll throw in, some body poems, some sex poems. She'll talk about people. She put people business in the streets. It's great. Right. So if you're nosy and you really love, somebody who's giving us the business, that's Miss Lucille, right? So I always say start at Miss Lucille, and then how do you evolve over time? Well, interestingly enough, so many of the poets in soul culture are really kind of walking in the footsteps of Lucille Clifton and Sonia Sanchez, because they kind of both start in 1960s, are kind of paving the way for all of these poets that come after. So those two are a great starting place. And then I think just moving your way down, if you move your way down through time, you get to see how Black poets and Black poetry is evolving throughout the 70s, the 80s, when we get, like Rita Dove, Thomas and Beulah. Rita Dove is another person that I wished I could interview for this project. And so in this book, I think you would kind of make your way to people like Natasha Trethewey, who walks very stridently in the footsteps of all those folks, but who's writing really formal poems, who's doing, a crown of sonnets that comes up in Native Guard that eventually, goes on to win the Pulitzer Prize as well. A. Van Jordan gets really heady in some of those later books. So I think you're building up to people that really delve into the depths of language and metaphor. And I think Miss Lucille eschews plenty of that early on. So she don't need any other, like any of the fancy stuff. She's brilliant. Don't get it twisted. But any of the fancy stuff to hook you in the way that other folks do. So I think I would trace the lineage kind of chronologically if I could.
Okay, thank you. That's definitely helpful.
Yeah.
So another cool aspect about your book is that as a reader, you get to see your evolution as a poet. And you see the influences that the 10 poets had on you and your life experiences have had on your work. And having read all 3 of your poetry collections, I thought that I got a newfound appreciation once I read Soul Culture, because I read those before I read Soul Culture.
Yeah.
And you know, and as you know, you've made references to all three of those books.
Yeah.
You include a handful of poems from
Mhm.
those collections, and so you get the full context from when you wrote them, why you wrote them, stuff like that. So I guess my question for that is, do you recommend that readers read your poetry before reading Soul Culture, or does that?
I don't think it matters. Now, I'm not gonna say don't go read the poems. Read the poems, people. Like that. That's just a wonderful. But I was really hoping to design Soul Culture so that if you hadn't read any of these folks, it
Mhm.
would do what you said you were doing while you were going through that. You would say, I don't know Erica Hunt's work at all, but I gotta go figure out what she's talking about. So
Mhm.
I was hoping that you people would jot down and kind of add to their library queue and kind of, add on Audible, these poets that they hadn't heard of. I thought that it was disingenuous if I did all this talking about how these poets shaped my life and shaped my trajectory as a writer, and then didn't put any of my own business in the streets. So that's why my poems are there. And so, because you also have to say, you're doing all this talk about craft. Well, girl, what did you do? Let's see
Mhm.
some of it, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So that was part of the reason that I wanted to make sure. And also, I was just really interested in a hybrid text in as many ways as we could. There ended up, fortunately, being portraits of the poets. There are poems there. There are footnotes. There are interjections in the form of emails. There's all this other stuff because this is how you form a life, right?
Mhm.
All these different disparate bits and pieces that when you look back on that life, you see how they connect. And so that's why I wanted to have the poems there. I think certainly it can help give you a fuller picture of my own coming of age as a poet if you read the books of poems that I've written. But no, I hope they all stand alone in a
Mhm.
way. And if someone is generous and kind like Raymond and goes and grabs all the books and then looks at them in context, I hope that'll give you a fuller picture of the range that's there as well.
Yes, and I definitely agree with you, especially if you do read Soul Culture first. I can see, like you said, where it would be like, because if you do love poetry, then you're like, okay, I'm gonna go get Starlight and Era,
Exactly.
stuff like that. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's perfect.
Yeah.
So your maternal grandmother, Mary Knight,
Yeah.
who was born in Scotland, North Carolina, which we
Come
talked
on.
about before, 1922.
Come on.
You said that she was an important person in your life, and
Mm.
specifically, you said she still colors every part of my life.
Yeah.
And I believe, tell me if I'm wrong,
Hmm.
but she's the baby that's referenced in this poem, Birth and Burden,
Yeah.
in this book.
Okay, Raymond. Listen, you are about to be my publicist and my best friend. Yes, she is. Ooh, ooh, nobody's put that together yet. Yes, of course.
Okay, okay. So, can you tell us a little bit about her influence on you, and what do you make of the fact that Soul Culture was released on the 100th anniversary of her birth?
First of all, I hadn't put that together. If you make me cry on YouTube, Raymond, we can still be best friends. But I don't know if I'm gonna forgive you for this. No, I'm sorry. I cry at Hallmark commercials, so it's all right. Almost anything can make
Yeah.
me cry. But I had not really and truly, I had never thought about that we were exactly 100 years away from her birth. I will tell you too, that question is really layered for me because I just finished the next book of poems, Room Swept Home, that is about her trajectory. So her
Mm,
and another grandmother of mine, I'm writing in their voices. And so that's been an interesting part of the journey to happen after Soul Culture as well. That poem that you referenced, Birth and Burden, that's kind of a family story that we heard in whispers that, when she comes into the world, her father is, running women and running around. And so, comes in, in the middle of the birth after getting shot in a gambling game. And so there's all kinds of there's all kinds of extra stories there, but she was the grandmother that I spent the most time with as a child. My mother is the youngest of seven. I'm the youngest grandchild in the bunch, and we were very
Mm-hmm.
close to my grandmother, and moved here from Phoenix. I'm in Norfolk, Virginia now, and moved here from Phoenix to help take care of her through the end of her life when she passed in '07. And so many of the stories that I learned that kind of trace my lineage are her stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of the like real love and respect and tenderness that I have for my elders is really just me seeing some aspect of her kind of everywhere that I go when I'm with my elders, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that this has kind of come full circle and that we are 100 years later, I think she would be fascinated. I think she did get to see kind of, the beginning of conversion, like my first book, Come Into the World. Um, but she definitely always said, them poems are nice. I don't know exactly what you're talking about, but the poems are nice. And so I tried to rectify some of that in Room Swept Home. It's a very different voice. I wanted to make sure my grandmothers kind of knew where I was coming from. And I did a lot of that in soul culture too. I wanted to tell the stories in the way that she knew I was telling them in her voice. She shows up in different manifestations. Even some of the crazy stuff that still comes up as family lore. Every time somebody gets married, she would say this weird little saying, courting is a pretty thing, marriage is a blossom. If you want to get your finger bit, poke it at a possum, which is crazy. It's something only people from Skyland Neck, North Carolina would say, right? But what she was saying was marriage is hard. Like, you better understand what you're jumping into. And now it's something we say all the time, like
Mm-hmm.
enjoy, but also in the same kind of like we are passing down whatever little wisdom we have from this person to you. So my hope in soul culture was passing down some of that wisdom that they had sounded down into me. So the fact that it's here 100 years later, it's a wonder.
Yes. Um, do you have a favorite poem of any of yours that you published in your earlier three books?
Oh, that's like asking me who my favorite child is. No, Raymond.
Well, let me rephrase it. Is there a poem that you come back to a lot that I guess is kind of like, you know, that centers you maybe or something like that?
There's actually, it's probably a poem that shows up in soul culture here recently. I
Mm-hmm.
can read it. It's not very long. Um, and it's called Young, Small, and Growing Violently.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do we have time for that? Do we have time for me to read it?
Sure.
Is that okay? All right. So, yeah, and it kind of circles around some of the things that we're talking about, but also young, small, and growing, often violently, is something that I found on the NASA website. That's how they describe stars in the
Mm-hmm.
sky, new stars that are born. Music can't save you, but it marks a place, and the knife can be a fierce negotiator. I learned this reckoning from the women raising me. My mother's four sisters, my father's three, grandmothers, play cousins, surrogate aunties. They crowd the table, throwing cards and customs, warbling. I take a shining to everything they allow me to hear. The whiz and kingdom melodies, Motown handle every haunt and opening. They tell me singing is my gift. Use it for rapture, not apology, and to cut any boy who messes with me. At funerals, weddings, school assemblies, my voice is their tender yield. Boys brave enough to try me always learn what I'm learning to be: a canticle, a straight blade, bigger than their scattering, curve and contour of mother's hands, echo, aurora, an orchestra, a galaxy. So I think that poem comes back a lot because it's really about like how I was shaped over time, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
I- One of the poems that keeps coming back in my mind from one of your books is, and I've always been like a big history person,
Oh,
so this might be why, this is probably why, but the poem is from, also from Conversion.
mhm.
The third king dreams of assassination.
Oh my goodness. Like, Raymond, let's talk about this.
Look.
This is why we're best friends because you're a history buff too. So that's so interesting. It's a poem that's completely outside of my personal experience because it's really about Martin Luther King III,
Mhm.
right? And so interesting. Why does it come back for you? Why is that something that stands out?
I guess for me it was, having, read a lot about civil rights movement and the people affiliated. You never think about what the kids experienced, what they saw. And specifically with him, it's like you see your dad killed,
Yep.
you see your uncle died,
Uncle drowned. Very
suspicious,
mysterious
yeah,
circumstances, right?
and
Your
then your grandmother
grandmother
killed in the
in
church.
church, right?
And it's just like, you never hear that point of view.
Yeah.
And the way you wrote that poem, it just kind of just stuck with me. And yeah, yeah.
Thank you. I I think like you, I'm the same way. I'm a history buff, English
Mhm,
all through school. It was English and African American studies or historical studies or lineage. Even when I teach a class like African American lit, it's
mhm,
African American lit and our cultural traditions, right? Because you can't do art outside in a marginalized group outside of their experience, right? And so that poem in particular, when I came across those details about the
mhm,
King family, about what happens after Dr. King is assassinated, I was like, how is it possible that we don't know this? Like
mhm,
I had no idea that his grandmother was killed in church. I think it's a little more known now, but I definitely didn't know about his uncle who was like, almost an Olympic swimmer who dies in this pool. There's so many different things, and those are the kinds of things in history, or really in any of my knowledge, like the little tiny details that I just can't let go of in my mind. And usually I have to write them out. Again, I'm writing to question. So I'm writing out like
mhm,
how in the world would I be able to manage to maneuver and still make my way into the world? Not be so frightened that I just stopped moving.
mhm,
So I think about that. I think about those children all the time. I was talking about in Conversion. It's really a coming of age kind of book. It's my first book, so I'm writing through my own personal experience, but also writing through the South and just kind of framing all of our lineage in a way, in any way that I can with these little details. So those details to me, those punctums, like Natasha Trethewey talks about in the photograph, the thing that stands out that arrests you and won't let you go. I think those make wonderful fodder for poems. So that's why they hold on to me too.
So, one of your essays in Soul Culture, Revision as Labyrinth,
Yeah.
you mentioned that for Starlight and Error, that you wrote over 100 poems, and then
Yep.
only 40 were actually published in the book. And
Absolutely.
so, and I know the rest of this story, but the first question when I read that part
Mhm.
was, was that painful to like narrow that down and exclude this poem, that poem, 60 poems over, and then keep these 40? Like, what is that process like, as when you're forming these collections?
Yes, it's painful, but then again, it's not because they don't all get to the same stage of being finalized, right? They're all fully formed, they're all revised. But like I said, a final poem that you see in any of my books has probably been through at least 30 revisions. Some of those 60 poems maybe only made it to revision 20 before I figured out, you're writing the same poem kind of twice here. And this one over here is much stronger than that one. So
Hmm.
follow that path instead of the other, right?
Okay.
So some of it is when I'm writing, and I talk about this in that essay and in the Standing in the Shadows of Love essay, I'm writing my obsessions. So
Mm-hmm.
your obsessions are going to come back over and over. So there's going to be several poems that are about one thing that, end up happening over the course of a manuscript, at least for me. And
Mm-hmm.
eventually I have to narrow down to who said it best. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
one poem has to kind of be the chosen one to carry that message, and some of the others fall away. Sometimes the poem is good. The poem works. There's a poem, um, here there's a sonnet in soul culture called Missing You, that's about the Diana Ross song from Marvin Gaye.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a love poem, and it's kind of about my parents and all those things, but I had written enough poems that Starlight and Error had its fill of that tone, so that poem didn't make it there, so it
Mm-hmm.
had to end up somewhere else. I was fortunate that it ended up in soul culture. um, and so sometimes it can be painful because you're letting go of things that like you've worked on, but you're really letting it go in favor of it being a stronger book overall.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
To connect with what you just said about the poem based off of the Diana Ross and Marvin Gaye song,
Yeah.
um, as you read this book, as readers read this book, you're going to realize that music is very important to you.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, you have poems referencing these songs. You have essays in here that's referencing to the Four Top song that you just mentioned,
Yeah.
"Shadows," "Standing in Shadows of Love." You got an essay where Beyonce is a central figure in connecting you and your daughter. I think there was one time you mentioned about you and Honore singing together.
Yeah.
So what is why how is music so important to you, or why is music so important to you? And then maybe did you have any, like, a playlist that as you were writing this book, or maybe a playlist that accompanies soul culture in any way?
There's a full playlist. There's like a 45 song playlist that I haven't released yet. So maybe I'll send it to you, Raymond, since we're best friends now. I will send you the soul culture playlist. Somebody asked me that the other week and I sent it to them. There's a playlist for every book that I write.
Okay.
But this one was extensive because there was so much going on in soul culture. But you've read all of the poetry books as well. And Starlight and Error is a book that's chock full of music as well. So many of those poems actually are titled with song titles. And so that was something that was deep in my psyche. In my household, music is the imperative art form. Like there's almost never not music playing, whether it's my husband funneling through a playlist, or my son yelling at Alexa while he's running through the house, or I'm on my headphones. Music is something that we go back to constantly. And it was the same way in my parents' house. And soul music in particular has kind of been something that's carried me throughout time. And so I knew if I was writing about soul culture, there really is, Black culture without Black music. You're missing so much of,
Mhm.
what we hold on to, what we inhabit, how we persistently and consistently make our way through dark times. There's so much there. So music ends up being just an integral part of my life. And so because I was writing my life, it ended up being an integral part of the work.
Mm.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your book banning story?
Oh, yes. Okay. Now my book banning, like the book that I got banned, or when my own book was banned, as I feel like karmic payback for
Uh,
something that I did in the seventh grade. Which one?
I was referring to the one you got banned.
Okay, let's
Yeah,
talk
yeah.
about it. Listen, I feel like you can't write a memoir without putting your absolute worst thing you ever did
Uh-huh.
all in the streets, because you're gonna tell other people's business. So if you're
Right.
gonna tell other people's business, you might as well put the worst thing you ever did in the streets. Now, there's plenty of context for this story, so don't kill me. I wish my camera was up a little bit harder so you could see the book above my head where it stays in my office. But so when I was in middle school, I went to school. I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, which, as you can imagine, Phoenix, Arizona, before the King holiday. So as you
Mhm.
can imagine, it was a place where you did not see much representation of who we were as Black folks. And also, like I literally, if it wasn't the same week, it was during the same time, the tumultuous time in family, but I was called a nigger for the first time. when I was in the 7th grade. And I think as we say it, we got to just say the word. I generally don't use the N word. I think of it as, an expletive, but I think it's important to like frame what was happening. My mother and I were coming back one night from Bible study and walking up to our apartment, and these guys slowed down in their truck. And we were very nervous because Phoenix is also, there's a lot of gang culture in Phoenix at the time. So there have been drive-bys on our street, so we were, kind of worried about what was going to happen. But they kind of threw the expletive out and a few other expletives and then just kept going down the street. Which was, such a strange experience for, carrying your little Bible and you got your long skirts on, such a strange experience for us. And not long after that, I would just sit in the library because I was a dorky kid and I loved to read. And my middle school had a really wonderful library. It was a new middle school at the time. And I found the book, The Black Poets, edited by Dudley Randall, which is, of course, a seminal text for African-American poets and anthologies. But when I opened the book, I opened to very early on, the anthology is structured with, there are folk poems all the way through kind of what people were doing in the late 60s, right? So what would have been the new Black Arts Movement era. But when I opened it, I opened to this folk poem that was called Run Nigga Run. And it had all of these, it was using dialect, it was using the N-word. It, to me, to my untrained ear and my untrained eye, and not understanding even what an anthology really was at that point, I just thought, oh my gosh, they have this book in the library that is like making fun of us in the way that these dudes just made fun of my mother and I. So I took it up to the librarian and I'm like crying, I have tears, all of my emotion about this incident is coming out. And the librarian, who's such a good-hearted person who knew me deeply and knew me to be a very staunch reader and the honor roll student, politely took the book. I said, this book, has profanity. We shouldn't have it here. And I never saw the book again. It disappeared from the shelves. Now, when I got to college, it was on every reading list I ever had in all my life because right, moved across the country and I was studying African-American literature. And I was like, oh my God, had I even turned a page, one, I would have found these people who shaped my life much earlier, right? I didn't come to the work of most of these poets until I was in college. But I was just so, in that moment, so afraid and angry that I kind of did the thing that I think is happening a lot right now, like this kind of snap judgment, this snap reaction, not thinking about what it does to the education of other students. I also didn't have someone there. That librarian, had I been in a different state, she was the kind of librarian who usually would say, well, let's look at this. Let's take some time. But I was just so upset that I'm sure it rattled her as well, right? So I don't blame her. It's okay, girl. We all right. And so that's my book banning story that I got, of all things, Dudley Randall's The Black Poets, banned from my middle school. But now I buy copies every chance I get, like put them into libraries, into students' hands, into prisons, everywhere I can, because now I know what an important text it was. But in that moment, sometimes you just have such a small-minded purview. And that's what it was. I had to come to a real understanding. So, it's the worst thing I ever done. Even though my mom says it's kissing a boy behind that same middle school, but I married him. He's sitting over there. It's all right.
So I got two short questions before we get to the audience questions, and we'll wrap up. So as this book, as we know from the book and from the subtitle, you said these are the Black poets, books, and questions that grew you up. So one of the questions I was curious about now is, who are the poets that you are helping to grow up?
Oh man. I mean, you know what? That's such a wonderful question. I think, I'm every poet that is coming into my classroom, I'm hoping that I'm helping to grow up in some way. And just in the interest of, shouting out some of the brilliant folks that I've worked with over time. I mean, there are wonderful poets like Marcus Jameson, and wonderful poets like, Ajane Dawkins and Brittany Rogers. And, so many of my grad students that are here. There are poets from The Watering Hole, poets from Cave Canem, poets that I'm teaching my little cousin Ariana Benson is a poet that just won the Cave Canem Book Prize. Go ahead, girl. And so there are, so many young poets that are a gift to us and are trying to tread the same legacy and are very serious about upholding the elders and bringing us into spaces along with them that they tread without us. I mean, they're way above and beyond so much of the work that we do. So I'm grateful. I try every poet that comes into my path that's serious about the work. I try to give them some of my space and my time in the same way that these poets did for me.
Nice. And you mentioned a little while ago, but what are you working on next?
I'm working on a few
If you
things.
can say, if you can say.
A few things. I can. So that book that I mentioned about my grandmother's room swept home. Hopefully that'll be the next thing that makes its way into the world. So it's about Mary Knight, and actually postpartum was kind of an ongoing mystery when she had her first child in 1941, and she was sent to the Central Lunatic Asylum for the Negro Insane in Petersburg, Virginia, diagnosed with water on the brain after she has her first baby at 18, and stayed there for a few months. And so I write through some of that history. And my great, great, great grandmother, paternal grandmother on the other side of my family, was within 1 mile of her in Petersburg at that time. She was interviewed for the WPA ex-slave narratives at the end of her life. And of course, as a poet and a history buff, when you hear those kind of facts, you can't let them go, right? Like I knew immediately, like, oh, I have to write about this at some point. So I've been working on that for a long time. And that's the next thing. I wrote a novel last summer, so we'll see if that ever makes its way into the light. Now I feel a little more comfortable and less scared and much less self-doubt about prose. So maybe it'll make its way to the light, but it'll be a long, long time coming.
Okay. One of our audience members, which is picks up greatly from what you just said.
Okay.
Said, has she ever considered writing a novel in verse?
I mean, hey, Kay, the reader. I have thought about it. There are so many brilliant, I was sitting with Elizabeth Acevedo's work a little while ago, and Nikki Grimes. I was looking back at some of Nikki Grimes' stuff. Mahogany Brown. I mean, there's so many folks that are doing really brilliant work, Kwame Alexander. And so I think I just have to figure out what the story would be. But I would absolutely consider it. Some of my biggest dreams as a writer is to make my way into the YA space. I think the novel that I'm working on is towing the line between YA and women's fiction. We'll see where it ends up. But that really is a dream for me. So if it happens, it'll probably be in the YA space.
Okay. And one more question from an audience member who says, after publishing several books over the years, what has become your personal, internal, or external inspirations?
Excuse me, just went down the wrong pipe. Personal. Be alive. Internal or external inspirations. Family is always going to inspire me. They come back over and over again. Other art is always going to inspire me. Whatever I'm reading is going to feed me. I tell my students, read 10 times more than you write. And I try to live by that mantra as well. And then, kind of little known sparks of information, dialogue. Like I listen to language a lot, like just the way people speak. That's always going to inspire me. So I think all of the work that you'll ever see from me is a coupling of those things, right? There'll always be some kind of dialogue. So I'll probably make my way into, writing plays at some point. Family will always come back, right? So those things are the things that continue to arrest me.
Okay. So our last couple of questions we tend to ask our guests, what is one or two books that changed your life?
Goodness, I had to mute myself to cough. I already said Quilting by Lucille Clifton. That's really true. Another one is Tim Sewell's Hurdy-Gurdy. I kind of relay it some in that last Revision as Labyrinth essay, but finding that book on a thrift store bookshelf um, just kind of knocked me out for a long time with what you could do with what contemporary poets were doing with language. So that book, coming to Toni Morrison, as most of us have learned, but coming to The Bluest Eye certainly was the first book I read, but coming to Sula and Song of Solomon, whew, I mean, just kind of an expansive view of what fiction could be used for, and how you could center your folks. And then beyond that, James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. When I came to that, novel, which is kind of autobiography in some ways for him, I just thought, my God, if you can center sensory experience and the ecstatic in this way, like what is impossible for us? Nothing is impossible.
All right.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, where can people find you online or on social media if they want to continue to follow your journey, follow your work?
Yeah, it's just at Remica Writer, Writer, at Remica Writer on Twitter and on Instagram. And I'm really on there pretty actively. Twitter is new for me, so please come find me because I don't have too many friends there yet, and I need to find more ways to interact with folks in that space. But right there, at Remica Writer, Twitter and Instagram. And if you reach out on my website, which is just remicabinghamrisher.com, I always reach back out to folks. So please, I love to talk to people.
Great. Any last thoughts or parting words you would like to impart on us before we end?
Really, truly, just thank you, Raymond. This was a phenomenal interview. Talk about an interviewer, from one interviewer to another. This is a phenomenal interview. I thank you for that deep dive into my work. That really and truly is kind of the gift, the best gift you can give to any writer. So I thank you for that.
And I thank you for your catalog. As I've said,
Nice.
yeah, if you haven't
Somebody
heard before,
screenshot it. Screenshot all the books.
let me get a little organized here.
Nice.
But definitely go buy Soul Culture wherever you buy books. And if you want to buy her poetry books, get those as well. Conversion, What We Ask of Flesh, Starlight and Era. Go get them. Go read them. I promise you will enjoy all 4 of her works.
Thank you so much.
And so before we go, we got a couple of housekeeping stuff. So Black Men Read as book club, we're having our next book discussion on Black, which is this graphic novel by Kwanzaa Osayefo, and the illustrator is Jamal Igle. And this is a book about what if only Black people had superpowers in the world. So it's really good so far. I've gotten through like the first issue. It's 6 issues in one book. So we're talking about this in a couple of weeks for October. And the last thing I want to mention is we have the Black Readers Conference is coming up October 28th, 29th, and the 30th. Black Men Read is one of the sponsors of that conference. And if any of y'all are interested, go to blackreaderscon.org. I'll put it let me type it up here, and then I'll put it on the screen. Blackreaderscon.org. There we go. And yes, I spelled that right. Blackreaderscon.org. Tickets are on sale, and we have a great group of folks that are going to be there. Robert Jones Jr., who wrote The Prophets, is a keynote speaker in conversation with Sadiqa Johnson, who wrote Yellow Wife, and Kwame Mbalia, who wrote the Tristan Strong series, is another keynote for Sunday. And then we have a VIP night for folks who like erotica books, and so the keynote for that is this author named J.L. Seegers. So,
oh my goodness.
So yes,
obviously everybody should go check it out.
So thank you. we're hoping it's gonna be great. This is our second time doing the conference, so we're looking forward to having a great time again. So thanks to everybody who showed up this evening. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. We will catch you all next time for another author chat, book discussion, what have you, for Black Men Read. So thank you all. We will see you all next time. Take care.
Bye.